joining in today. And we sincerely hope that you all are doing well and miss seeing you in person, but are glad that we're able to connect this way. We are very excited to have Dr. John Curtis back with us again for a training on strategic planning. He has been helping us out a lot lately, so you might have been on some other trainings with him, but I won't waste too much time. The foundation hopes you're doing well, and I'm going to go ahead and give it over to John.
That's great. I like brief introductions. So let me share the screen. Welcome everybody and get us started here. I did push the record button, by the way, for all. So in case that question does come up and people want to know about that. Screen sharing. Can you all see that now?
Yes.
All right, very good. And I'm going to go ahead and launch the program. Welcome again. My name is John Curtis. I'm based out of North Carolina, actually, but spend a lot of time in your area teaching for the Duke Nonprofit Management Program in both Danville and Martinsville, which is how I've come to know Caitlin and the foundation. And just good to be with you all and have a chance today to get into our content here. What I want to take a moment to do is just briefly cover the objectives for the day to make sure we're clear and have a set of expectations that hopefully I'll meet by the time we're all finished, and we will be finished right on time. Again, my name is John Curtis. I'm with a firm called IOD Incorporated, and I've been doing capacity building with nonprofits since about 1986. Our firm was started in 1999. And mainly that involves board development, strategic planning, and fundraising. So for today, the objectives of what we're going to cover, and I do want to state that it was great to see 60 plus organizations sign up. And as I look at the list here of those of you that have signed up, I see there's a lot of executive directors and board chairs, development officers, a wide variety of staff members, but it's great to see in particular leadership sign on for today. Let's talk a little bit further about the objectives, and that should resonate with what you saw in the original marketing piece. We want to talk about different approaches to planning because there are many and they get commingled at times and can cause some confusion. So we want to make sure we're talking about different types of planning and help you identify what planning may be appropriate for you. We want to talk about do's and don'ts, the data gathering. If I were to say it in a nutshell, there's phases to planning that start with data gathering, and then decision making, and then implementation. So this objective number 2 is really about that data gathering that can be very extensive. And in the old days, frankly, expensive because it took a lot of time. One of the advantages that we'll really delve into is the online world and being able to work virtually when doing your SWOT analysis or environmental scan. The roles and responsibilities. There's some crossover between staff and board during the planning process, but I want to describe and articulate specifically what I think are the board's responsibilities versus the staff's responsibilities. And perhaps when we get to that section, there'll be some folks nodding their head. Yep, that's what I've been telling our ED all this time, or gee, that's what I've been telling our board chair about roles and responsibilities. But the old phrase, stay in your lane, is important when it comes to planning, and we want to talk about that in greater depth. And then this whole idea of the language of planning. What's a vision? How's that different than a mission? What are values and objectives? To make sure that we have a common language that we all agree with regarding the planning process. So that's it for today, besides the real last point, which may be why some of you are actually on the call right now, because you know you need to plan again, but last time it didn't go real well. And we'll talk a little bit about why the research says planning fails and how to avoid those pitfalls. Hopefully on the upside, as some of you heard Caitlin say at the very beginning, the foundation has a strategic plan. They update it annually, and it sounds to be, Caitlin, to put words in your mouth, one key to your success is the fact that you have a plan that really guides the decision-making and the direction of the foundation. So those are the objectives of where we're headed. I do want to take a moment, my favorite organizational development consultant, Mark Twain, along with, frankly, Babe Ruth and a few other of those well-known celebrities from days gone by. And I have paraphrased Mark Twain's quote, "It ain't what you don't know about strategic planning that can get you into trouble. It's what you do know for sure that just ain't so." And I highlight this briefly to say that as we had the time and had at this stage, we're up to 39 participants. Each of you describe what you think strategic planning is. The odds are we'll hear 39 different descriptions, some of which may be accurate and on point with what we're going to cover today. Some may be outside of what I'm going to discuss. But the thing is that so many of you in the nonprofit sector, as kind of the primary tool in the toolbox, it's got to be strategic planning for a variety of reasons. So probably everybody on the call has a long track record and experience with strategic planning, but what you know about it, what you believe to be true about it, may not in fact reflect reality in the post-COVID world, in the 21st century world we live in. So there's Mark Twain, and enough on that. Why plan? And this is a justification in case you're running into a situation with staff or board about why are we even doing this in the first place. It's always been important, but imagine trying to build a house without a blueprint. Imagine trying to plan a vacation without an itinerary and if you will, at least a map for those of us maybe making driving trips. So proper planning has some key elements we want to talk about. Data-driven decisions, and we're going to discuss the role of data-driven decisions, specifically in the role of the board, frankly, when it comes to planning. That leads to clarity, focus, and momentum. And I think it's a real important concept to slow down on for just a minute. Clarity. We clearly know who we are, what we're about, where we're headed, we're focused. And at the same time, I think planning is an opportunity to also decide what we are not. And so, and some of you maybe have run into situations where you have somebody in the community that is disappointed in your nonprofit because you're not delivering on something they think you ought to be doing, and it's not ever part of your plan in the first place. It's not part of your mission. It's not who you are and what you're about. It's about managing expectations, and proper planning can really help with that clarity and focus. Once we're clear and we're really focused on what we're going to do and not going to do, it also allows us to accelerate the momentum of what we're trying to achieve. So next, what you get out of that is that feeling of success. People want to work for successful organizations that are doing good. And so for board, staff, and volunteers that see the benefit of a plan and the clarity and the focus and the momentum that comes from that, including their own roles, tend to be more committed and more loyal to an organization that, if I may say it simply, kind of has its act together, has a plan, works the plan, lives out of the plan, continues to help the plan evolve over time. So you get a high performing, and this is one of those best practice things that you've heard about, but clearly, whether you're on the call because you have a funder who needs to have a new strategic plan from you, whether you've been hired as a new leader to replace a retiring one or one that was not performing as well, one of the things that you tend to get out of proper planning is a higher performing nonprofit. And in a nutshell, for anybody on the call that has any responsibility of guiding and leading a nonprofit, I think that's your single primary responsibility, is to move your organization down the continuum from dysfunctional to highly functional. And everybody on the call has a nonprofit that's somewhere on that continuum. High-performing nonprofit is what you get out of doing proper planning. And then the impact. The issue shows, and this is not meant to be, if you will, as negative as it's going to sound, the predictions run for the state of Virginia that anywhere from 10 to 15% of the nonprofits in Virginia today will close their doors by the end of the year. It's just going to happen, just like small businesses and larger ones as well that are in trouble nationwide. There's a certain percentage of the 1.4 million nonprofits in America that will cease to exist at the end of this year. As I heard a funder the other day say, you know, COVID is sort of like a forest fire. It's killing off a lot of trees, but it's going to present opportunities for growth and development going forward. And those funders, institutional funders in particular, but even individual donors, are going to be real interested in knowing what difference do you make? What is your impact? And planning can help ensure that you have verifiable impact. That satisfies stakeholders, the community, and then lastly, that financial sustainability. People want to give to winning organizations, and nobody quite knows what 2020 is going to look like when it comes to philanthropy. Most everybody on the call is aware that it's gone up every single year. As of 2019, we had nearly $350 billion given philanthropically. Don't know what's going to happen, obviously, in 2020, but clearly financial sustainability is more likely going to happen in an organization that's doing proper planning. So there's a little model and an opportunity to look at why planning is important and why you need to be doing it. Things to consider, I won't read all these to you, but certainly strategic planning is a time to ask and answer these questions that you see on your screen. And I would offer, there's a couple that I want to highlight, especially in this post-COVID world. Number 4, do we lead or respond to the community? And we'll come back to that. And also, what does success look like and how might that change as far as that metric goes post-COVID? So planning is a time to address these hard questions. And it is in this expedient world we live in, as I rapidly run through this content in barely 45 more minutes, it's hard to get people to slow down long enough to have the discussion, to ask and answer these questions. But that's a lot of what planning is about, perhaps only that one time a year when we really slow down as a team, as a staff, as a board, and really discuss and explore and do critical thinking around who we are and what we're about. So this is a time to do that when it comes to planning. Now, one thing to highlight that may be a little different for many of you on the call is to think about the role of planning depending on the stage of organizational maturity. Because I won't ask now, but I can be certain that there's some folks on the call that are in a nonprofit that's less than 3 years of age. And no doubt there are some nonprofits that are represented on this call that are 30 years or old or more. Some with budgets less than $250,000, perhaps some with budgets over 10 million. So not unlike the human person, as you grow from birth to adulthood, there are stages that you go through very predictably. And the type of planning that you do is, frankly, among other things, should be controlled or dictated by your stage of development. So, and again, I won't read all these to you. You should hopefully have the handout by now and be able to look at and follow along in that 3-slide per page format. But if you're at birth, you're less than 3 years of age, essentially as a nonprofit, you know, planning is really about keeping the doors open, and you may feel very scared and vulnerable because you might see yourself as one of those 10 to 15% of the nonprofits in Virginia that may not make it to the end of the year. But if you're a 30-year-old as a nonprofit, then the odds are you've grown beyond this birth stage, and we'll talk a little bit further here about the childhood stage. Planning is a year to 2 out. I want to again read all of those to you. We grow over time, and this has some implications for the board's role that I'll come back to again in greater detail in a minute. But the simple analogy I would offer is all of you would know that have young children that have grown into adulthood, that the way you parent a 3-year-old should be different than the way you parent a 33-year-old. The way the board helps govern and direct and guide a 3-year-old nonprofit should be very different than how the board acts with a 33-year-old nonprofit. So that's another way to further link this idea of stages of development, both for nonprofits and for the human person. If you'll notice, stage 3, puberty, is highlighted because the research says most nonprofits, from a functionality point of view and culture point of view, don't grow beyond this stage. They're actually plateaued and stuck here in many cases, or may, because of the current crisis financially, frankly, may not be able to evolve beyond puberty. But to get the next 2 phases up there, when it comes to planning for an adult nonprofit, 20, 25, 30 years or more of age, you've been in business for a long time, the odds are the executive director, you're not the founder, you weren't the original one. The odds are as board members, you weren't around when you first got started because it's now 25 to 35 years old. You've reached adulthood when it comes to some of the characteristics of maturity of a nonprofit. And then lastly, just to get this window up and have you have a chance to look at, planning is much longer in range. Some might say, how can you plan very far into the future with this crazy world we currently live in? But nevertheless, this is a model to consider when you pick which stage or type of planning that you might do. So I wanted to highlight, and when we get into Q&A, actually in just a minute, I'll slow down and open it up for some brief questions in this stage, and then we'll go on, cover more content, and have another Q&A session at the very end. But I did want to offer this up and have you take a look at it. So what type of plan should you do? So briefly now, again, you all can follow along. Tactical planning, just had today an arts organization in another state that said, gee, we're not ready to do that. We're moving to a new office. And so their short-term tactical plan is really getting ready by the end of this year to be in their new facility, offering new programs and new services, and they will have closure once they get into that new office and they've reached the end of the calendar year. Long-range planning is probably what more organizations do than not. They may call it strategic, but oftentimes it's just incrementally building on past accomplishments. Not bad or wrong, just typically what we did last year going forward plus 10% next year, and that whole idea of building incrementally. Strategic is really about being unencumbered by the past. To sound trite and to date myself, it's when John Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon and return a man safely by decade's end, and we had no idea how we were going to do that. And some of you have seen the speech, certainly some of you heard it live in 1961 when he made that declaration. And in 1969, obviously, we made it. That's true strategic planning. And you all may be, frankly, driven by the COVID crisis that's impacting you, say, yeah, we are at strategic planning. We're looking to completely reinvent ourselves, to use that trite cliche, and do something much different going forward. And we are embracing and interested in strategic planning. Frankly, that's why we signed up for this webinar. And then the one that seems most appropriate and a good argument, even if you have a recent strategic planning initiative, perhaps one you did earlier this year before anybody could predict what was going to happen with COVID, or perhaps you went through that experience back in 2008 when the recession was hitting everybody in every sector of the economy, and you did some scenario planning around what's going to happen as a result of this recession. Having been from Florida originally, you know, it's like planning for the party of emergency managers in city and county governments all over the state. What happens if a level 5 hurricane hits us? That's that whole scenario planning idea. And it can be a really interesting activity, especially if some of you listening in are looking for a fresh new approach, something different than the normal way in which you do planning. The board is asking for it. The staff looks for it. Maybe what you propose this time around is not so much strategic planning as it is scenario planning. So we can talk more about that in the Q&A section in just a minute as well. So who does what in the planning process? And oh, by the way, there may be certainly some hybrids that would do a little bit of strategic planning in some areas regarding the communities that we serve, because we want to branch out and reach out into Henry County, or you fill in the blank, or gee, maybe what we're going to do is a scenario plan only this year. There may be a combination of these that you see on the screen. But moving right along, who does what in the planning process? I'm just going to expose these very quickly on the screen, and I won't read all of them to you, but the board has a critical role to play. And we'll talk about boundaries and staying in your lane in just a minute, but that whole idea of what's our vision, what's our mission, and what's our strategic direction, clearly a role and a responsibility that the board has. So when it comes to planning responsibilities, and probably number 6 on the list is also critical, and one of the stages of development for a mature nonprofit and a best practice, and even perhaps what some of your funders are looking at, does your board evaluate its own efficiency and effectiveness and performance against that strategic plan? It committed 3 years ago to achieve these objectives in the summer of 2020. How you doing? So the board has a critical role to play in item number 6 as well as, of course, reviewing management's roles and responsibilities. The staff, let me go ahead and get these up. Not that the staff doesn't influence vision and mission, but more appropriately, in most cases, the staff has a role to play to go implement that vision and mission and strategic direction. And then also the issue of accountability, which we can talk more about in the Q&A section. But the whole idea of what is my responsibility in fulfilling the plan, and to jump way ahead to something regarding making sure the plan is used. And I'm just curious if you're able to, in your acknowledgement area and showing some kind of response, how many of you actually have fulfilling the strategic plan as part of your job description? Something to think about. If the plan is to be part of what we do, I've got a job description. Does it include fulfilling my responsibilities in strategic planning? So moving right along, what I want to talk about here is the issue of what I would call the is in the to be state. But I want to pause for just a moment. I'm going to ask for your help here, Caitlin. If I've gone too fast, covered something so very quickly, and you just need to find out, if you will, a little bit more, have a question in particular, I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment and open it up to anybody typing in a question. And let's just pause for a moment. Just take a couple of minutes out of our busy, fast-paced schedule here and see if there's a burning question anybody needs to ask right now. Please go ahead and type that in the chat window on the right-hand side. We'll take a moment to see if anything pops up. Questions about what I've covered so far, please.
Hey, John, can you hear me now? It's Caitlin.
I can. Yes.
Okay, great. I'm in the chat right now. I don't see anything, but also if you'd like, you could unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask your question that way as well, if that's easier.
Certainly. Didn't realize I was muted. Let me go back to sharing the screen and all right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Again, the question is, are there any questions? But having heard none, realizing some of you literally may be eating lunch and you got your hands full and your mouth full and you're just watching and listening, we'll just go ahead and move on. There'll be another Q&A session here at the very end. I know it's whirlwind. Welcome again, John Curtis here. And we're talking about strategic planning today and its role, especially in a post-COVID world. A conceptual model that you'll see on your screen now. And that is just really about taking a look at what I call the as is and the to be state. And let me go ahead and animate that. The as is and the to be. Compelling forces. Some of you are about to do planning because there's an increasing need for your services. The community has rising expectations of what you should do and can do and ought to be doing. Obviously, the dynamic economy, who knows what that's going to look like. And then, as always, you're expected to do more with less. What gets in the way is, I just had this the other day, a group staff of 6, they've had to lay off 3 people. The workload has not gone down, it's actually gone up. And they only have 3 people to perform versus 6. The COVID pandemic, who knows what that's going to be, social turmoil and existing workloads. So planning in a nutshell, one way to think about it is really gathering information to get an accurate picture of our to be state, our as is state, then gathering decision makers together to determine our to be state. But the key piece, and I want to come back to this later about why planning doesn't work, is we just assume we'll move from as is to be and forget about the change management piece. And that can be a fatal error when it comes to planning. And we'll again come back to that. So the planning process, let me go ahead and talk about that. Timing, we're where we need to be at 12:23, but I want to just talk about the vocabulary, if you will, for planning and make sure we all have a common understanding. The inventory, that data gathering, that going to the doctor and getting the test run to find out your current as-is state of your health, of your nonprofit. Some know it as the SWOT analysis. We'll talk about that further, or the environmental scan, or whatever you may call it. I call it an inventory. That's an objective analysis of the factors that could or do impact your organization. And it's the first step, I believe, in any planning process. Next is the vision. Now, you may or may not have a vision statement. You may or may not have a need for a vision statement, but for the sake of today, I'm defining vision as a future ideal state. One world without hunger, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Those are all vision statements. You'll never achieve them, but it's the direction in which you move as an organization. Mission, on the other hand, is why do we exist? What are we here to try to accomplish? And then if you look at the goal areas, which these are typical in a nonprofit, I won't read those to you, but this begins to identify broadly sort of buckets of activity in your nonprofit, followed by measurable objectives, which we'll talk about in greater detail, and then the action steps. So this is, to use that building analogy, we have the architectural renderings of the house we're going to build, but tomorrow the concrete truck shows up to pour the foundation. And in a month, the framers show up to build the walls. And it's all those steps that are necessary at the micro level, the action step level, to ultimately produce the house that we're trying to build, as another metaphor or way to think about planning. So that's a model. This is not the model with a capital T. It's a model on the planning process. And just wanted to get that up for everybody to look at. And again, if you've got questions, make note of that. We'll come back and revisit the Q&A here in just a few more minutes. So moving beyond that, I just want to give you a visual of what it actually could look like. And in many cases, in the old days with an in-person planning retreat, as you all would know, maybe there are breakout groups, there are easels with flip charts and markers and facilitators, and we're brainstorming objectives and program areas and facility areas or fundraising goal areas, and beginning to build something that looks like this, fleshing out action steps and so on. Now, one thing I want to highlight in this dotted line, and this gets into a real critical role as nonprofits evolve over time, from a startup nonprofit where the board is doing everything. I mean, they're rolling up their sleeves literally and cleaning out the animal cages at your animal shelter, or they're there serving food to the homeless that are coming to your kitchen, or they're there helping with a stage setup, if you will, for a performance at your performing arts center. As the organization evolves over time, there's a good argument to be made that the board's role is to disengage, back to staying in your lane, from the day-to-day operations of the nonprofit and begin to move into external functions of advocacy, community relations, and fundraising. So the exception, and my point here, is that one time a year that the board has an opportunity to ask questions, make recommendations, brainstorm objectives with everyone else around program goals, facility goals, staffing goals. That's the appropriate time for them to intrude in the boundaries of day-to-day operations of the nonprofit, because they're knowledgeable, they're committed, they're involved, they're passionate, and perhaps have a long history with your nonprofit. Once decisions are made around those areas, the argument here is the board then steps back and takes on its role that's external in nature for a maturing nonprofit of advocacy, community relations, and fundraising, and they quit meddling in your business, frankly. So as an executive director, some of you may know what it's like to have a micromanaging board that's talking to you about programs and services where it's really not the board's responsibility because you're a 30-year-old nonprofit. So not to sound critical of anybody, but it's that analogy that I stated earlier. When now that your 3-year-old has grown to a 23-year-old, do you stop giving them day in and day out advice? At some point in time, you got to let go is the message here. So that's why that dotted line showed up, just to say that one time a year, it's appropriate for the board to overstep its boundaries into day-to-day operational objectives, in my opinion. So, and ultimately what you end up getting is, and it may be a 3-ring notebook that's got a tab set, time, programs and services and facilities and staffing and advocacy and community relations and so on. And it has these kind of action planning forms, which we can gladly get you a blank of. It's not rocket science, but this is the level of detail I believe that you need to be showing in your plan. So somebody can go to that tab, open it up, go to a measurable objective and see what's our deadline date, what outcome did we achieve, and so on and so forth over whatever window of time we've declared our plan to cover, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, how many years it may be. So having said that, the glossary of planning, I want to go into a little more detail. First of all, looking at the strengths, some of you know the SWOT analysis, some of you it may be a brand new concept. So when we're looking at determining your as-is state, this is a tried and true model. It makes perfect sense to most folks, and you can simply ask on online surveys and interviews and focus groups, you know, what do you see to be our internal strengths, our external threats, and so on and so forth, and begin to build the list in defining your SWOT, if you will. And that's a model I would assume most everybody on this call is familiar with and has seen before. At some point in time, you may get so much information in because you're getting qualitative responses, then you may begin to categorize themes and trends and patterns. But generally speaking, the SWOT analysis takes a look at strengths and weaknesses internally, opportunities and threats externally and summarizes those to help inform decision-making when you get to phase 2 of your planning process. Phase 1 is that data gathering. So keep in mind, and this is an important part and one of the things that makes, frankly, easier to do strategic planning than ever before, is in doing your internal focus board effectiveness surveys, opinionaires, even interviews can all be done virtually, certainly with Zoom calls or just standard telephone calls. So when it comes to gathering the data, in the old days, hiring a consultant who came in and did the surveys, interviewed the board, went out, talked to people in the community, you can now do all of that virtually. And so these are just some of the mechanisms you might use to look at what I would call that internal focus. Some of you may have questions about what these would look like, but nevertheless, these are kind of the items in the toolbox when it comes to doing your SWOT analysis and how you gather that data. When you go to the doctor, they draw blood, they take an x-ray, they do an EKG, they check your blood pressure, all of those vital signs in which they monitor when you literally go to the doctor. This is an example of that. The external focus gives you an opportunity, again, to use these tools that are online surveys being a great one. If you don't have a SurveyMonkey account, get one. Scheduling telephone interviews is relatively easy to do. And I do want to highlight one other thing here when it comes to the external focus, talking to your external, if you will, stakeholders, other agencies that you refer to or refer to you, other arts organizations that you work with, and so on and so forth. Don't underestimate the value, and this is another great advantage of the internet this day and age, is to Google other organizations who do what you do. I realize in the 1.4 million nonprofits in America, you know, there's a lot of duplication in the large metropolitan areas in Virginia. You may know 3 other agencies who do a lot of what you do, or actually the same thing that you do. They just do it in another region, or certainly in other cities in other parts of the country. Don't hesitate. And I would really suggest, especially if you've done planning more than once, maybe it's time that you reach out and actually do interviews of executive directors of 4 other organizations like yours in other parts of the country. Lessons learned, what are they doing, what's working, what's not, what advice do they have? They've been at it 20 years, you've been at it 3 years, and so on and so forth. So this whole idea of research on other similar organizations, I urge you to consider strongly. And again, it's so easy to do virtually, online, surveys, interviews, and so on. So from a labor intensity point of view, the richness of the data that you can get is easier than ever, and the cost in time and dollars has gone down because of being able to contact people virtually, of course, or just like we're doing right now in a Zoom call. So moving right along, once we look at that, here are the goals and some examples, and just those of you that may be very particular, and I recommend that if you have some confusion in planning. A goal is not an objective. Excuse me, an objective is not a vision is not a mission. So goals, objectives, and action steps. You have those in your handout, so I won't read all of those to you, but this gives you a little bit of a feel of what is an action step that rolls up to a measurable objective, that rolls up to a general goal area that we want to achieve. And for those of you that are having some challenges and problems with getting planning to work, it may be that you're not drilling down to a level of measurability that is important enough. And as a simple metaphor, a board chair said the other day, well, it's like we all collectively say we want to lose weight. Well, that's great. That's a wonderful thing to try to achieve, but how are we going to do that? And by how many pounds and by what date and what methods are we going to use to lose weight? Let's get more specific if we expect to be successful in our dietary goals and our weight loss goals. So this is language, if you will, that describes the steps involved in planning. And again, I'll slow down long enough just to give you a chance to review what's on the screen in case you do not have that handout in front of you. But this is really about making sure that we have the various elements of plans detailed and specific. Now, having said that, there's one other aspect, and it's just another acronym, not unlike SMART. Many of you heard about, and I just wanted to get it out today, literally on the screen. And this is really, in a nutshell, if nothing else, the most important thing, in my opinion, that you have in your strategic plan, that is your SMART objectives: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. I need to be able to read the objective and I see exactly what needs to be accomplished. Okay, I see the outcome you're looking for, quantity, quality, frequency, and so on. Is it still relevant to who we are and what we're about? Is it achievable, and what are the deadlines? So the SMART model works well. Many in the private sector also know this acronym. I find business executives are used to hearing this, so he or she may be a good spokesperson to your board to say, gee, this is what we use in our firm and our corporation as well. But it's one more training tool here, one more, if you will, tool you might have in your toolbox when it comes to writing a plan, is making sure our objectives are, in fact, SMART. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. I think probably most everybody on this call has seen the model, heard the model, but don't want to assume, because we have nonprofits from all across the board when it comes to level of maturity. So moving right along, here's again to feed this template that I talked earlier. You can see how answering the SMART acronym should give you the content necessary to fill in each of the areas on an action planning form such as this, a form that could easily be put up in Google Sheets or Google Documents and done online. And again, that's the beauty of being able to work virtual, is you can have the same document in front of everybody at the same time, work very efficiently using one of those free online tools. So moving right along, and this is an important one to cover, and I want to spend a little bit more time on this as we begin to wind down and get ready for our Q&A, and please get your questions ready. Being inclusive. And this is so very important. Earlier, you may have heard me talking with Caitlin about the fact that the foundation that's hosting and sponsoring this very event today has a strategic plan. Caitlin, you've been on board since when?
Since June of 2019, so a little over a year.
Yeah. And how were you engaged in the planning process? How did they include you?
So we actually have a whole team, third-party team working on it with us right now, and we were called out individually to talk about what we believe our strengths and weaknesses are and where we see the foundation going in the future. And then part of that will be collecting that data and then coming together as a team to discuss where to go from there.
Excellent. Now, I won't further put you on the spot, but imagine for any of you that may be on the call because you're having a hard time, and this is really about the change management piece between the as-is and the to-be state. And this is an extreme example, but it's a true story, and this is probably 15 years ago. I had an administrator of a healthcare facility in South Florida call me to say that he was having a hard time getting his board and staff to act on the strategic plan. I said, well, tell me a little bit about the formation of the plan. He says, well, I spend about a week every year at home on my computer developing the plan. He was a single person writing a strategic plan for a multi-million-dollar, several hundred employee healthcare facility, and wondered why I couldn't get people to buy into the plan. An extreme example of not being inclusive. So the cliche out of change management is people were more likely to underwrite that which they write. And so get everyone involved. Ask volunteers, ask staff, ask donors, ask stakeholders in the community, ask anybody who has a role to play in the success of your organization, or to put it another way, that if they're not on board and aligned and supportive, could limit the success of your organization. Be inclusive, cast that large net. It does become more time consuming, but frankly, if you're moving to online, you're doing online surveys, you're doing online focus groups for that matter, and certainly one-on-one telephone interviews, it's a relatively easy thing to do, but it's very important to be inclusive. So now we have a plan that we're implemented, that we wrote, versus that's that plan they're trying to do change to us rather than with us, as somebody once said to me long ago. One key to successful planning, building consensus. Consensus is a messy process. It goes back to what I said earlier about this expedient world. You all are looking at your watches. It's 21 minutes till the hour. You expect me to be done on time, which I will be. We're all in a hurry. This is the one time of the year. In the old days with retreats, that's why people call them retreats, to stand back from day-to-day operations And in many cases, you had to go off-site, get a remote facility somewhere, a hotel ballroom, a retreat center in the mountains of Virginia or wherever, to stand back, slow down, and deliberate to build consensus. That can still be done virtually. Keep in mind that consensus is not unanimity, but you do need the full support and consensus behind decision-making. And it's really important that you get people to buy into and sign off on this. So next is treat nothing as sacred. Now may be a great time, and some of you may groan and roll when I say this, but clearly that 1.4 million nonprofits in America, of which 10 to 15% of them in Virginia will go away by the end of the year. And the institutional funders are looking for collaborations, partnerships, and even mergers. So perhaps you've never ever thought about merging, but now perhaps it's time. Treat nothing as sacred. One of the things that's very critical is look around who else is serving the same population you serve, who else is upstream or downstream in that continuum of care that you provide. You know, perhaps you're a homeless shelter. It's time to talk to the food bank. It's time to talk to the community health center. It's time to talk to a variety of other agencies that work with the same population you do, and perhaps come together in a structured partnership, not just a loose gathering of nonprofits, or maybe even merge. So treating nothing as sacred may be a name change. Maybe it's time. Maybe it's time you move to a new location, perhaps downsize or become more efficient across a geographic area. Treat nothing as sacred. A no excuses approach. It's going to be easy during the post-COVID time to say, well, funding is down. We have no clear evidence, by the way, that major donors have any less wealth post-COVID than they did pre-COVID. Major individuals with wealth, high net worth individuals, some of you know them already, have balanced portfolios. The markets return to the if you will, COVID level. They may have the same level of wealth they had before. Don't assume. Ask your donors. Don't assume that there's going to be less money available to you, if you will. And I know there's some exceptions to this. You get government funding. Government has fewer tax dollars from sales tax going down, if you will. There's going to be reasons, but don't just assume and have that blanket approach that, well, it's post-COVID, nobody's got any money, that's why our funding is down. Data-driven decisions is critical, especially, and this is a whole nother model we can talk about in greater detail, if you're trying to move from a personality-driven nonprofit where we've had one board member, the board chair, we've had the original founder who's got founder syndrome, and he or she, they're trying to drive the bus. And they're asking us to do things. They're telling us not to do things based on their own personal biases or preferences without any data to support it. So a key to successful planning is making sure you have the data to drive those decisions. Ensuring measurability and accountability may seem like a no-brainer, but certainly don't say just, well, we want to lose weight. Make sure we have specific measurements and we're able to, if you will, track along the way how we're doing. Our construction deadline on the building of our house, crossing the next state boundary on our driving trip, following our map, whatever it may be sure you're doing that. Being future focused may seem obvious, but this is about that strategic, we're going to the moon versus long range. We're just going to do more next year of what we've done this year. Being sure to use the plan. I think this is one key element, and let me digress even a little bit further here. If you're going to use the plan and it's part of guiding the board's decision-making and the staff's decision-making, then certainly every single board meeting going forward ad infinitum should have a standing item on the agenda, just like reviewing the minutes of last month's meeting, to say a status report on the measurable objectives in our plan that are due this month. We need to be monitoring the plan on a regular basis. If you're working virtual and meeting virtual, it's really easy to do this if you're using Google Sheets, for example. Everybody can see, gee, we have a measurable objective in the goal area called governance. By this month, the board was to complete a new board orientation program. Susan, can you give an update on the status of that objective? Bill, can you tell us how things are going with your advocacy plan and reaching out to the county commission or whatever? Use the plan. As I said earlier, put the plan and the accomplishment of the plan in job descriptions. Be sure to use the plan. If not, you run the risk of it sitting on the shelf collecting dust, and you all can relate to that, and some heads will nod. Build in follow-up. Great idea. It made perfect sense in the summer of 2020, a year later, when we thought we were going to cross the finish line on this measurable objective. It no longer makes sense. So build in follow-up, evaluate the plan, adjust accordingly. Caitlin, I think you said you all have an ongoing planning process at the foundation and you do an annual checkup. Is that correct? Did I hear you correctly on that?
Yes.
Great. So the annual checkup, plans move forward? Yes. Do you pick a window, 1, 2, 3, 5 years? Certainly. But do you refresh and revisit every year? Absolutely. So some keys, if you will, to successful planning, building in the follow-up, that lets people know it's important. If you do it once, set it aside and go back to the business as usual, then you wonder why plans are not used or followed. You certainly are sending a clear message. This is no longer important. We just did it once. So keep in mind that building in the follow-up is very critical. I can't reiterate or reinforce that enough. Also, when it comes to new staff orientation and new board orientation, their role in the planning process, a copy of the strategic plan should be given to board members, to be given to staff members to make sure they understand. A new program person, a new board member that's going to be on your development committee needs to understand the objectives that were set by the existing board in the last planning cycle when it comes to that particular area of, again, advocacy, community relations, or fundraising. So make sure you're bringing people on board and educating them as soon as possible beyond the obvious. Here's the key to the men's room. Here's the key to the women's room. Here's where you park. Here's your office. Here's your log on to the website. Here's your password to get to the board protected portion of the website. And oh, by the way, here's your responsibility in fulfilling the strategic plan. Be sure to build in follow-up. So we can come back and revisit these, but this is a growing list over time. In a minute, when we open it up to Q&A and anybody's got another key they have found in successful planning, please add that in the chat function, because I'm open to learning and listening and knowing what you've learned along the way as key to successful planning. Planning can be a rich and rewarding experience that makes all the difference in the world between a successful and a barely marginal surviving nonprofit. But we don't want to take it lightly. It is a challenging thing to do, and depending on the age and maturity of your nonprofit, can obviously be quite complicated and time consuming. So that's it. My favorite consultant about, if you will, planning. If here's Edward Baird coming downstairs now, bump, bump, bump on the back of his head behind Christopher Robin. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs, but sometimes he feels there really is another way if he can only stop bumping for a moment and think of it. And for many of you, planning, yes, that sounds good. That sounds fine. Love to do it. I'm too busy right now to do planning. Thank you for carving out a few minutes in your day to join me on this webinar about strategic planning. And hopefully, if you didn't already have all the evidence you needed and put a stake in the ground when it comes to the calendar, and you've already got your planning retreat virtual this year, of course, set in the calendar, great. If you're looking for further justification, it's time to stop bumping long enough. And frankly, the COVID crisis is a further amplification of the need to do that. Now is the time to stop bumping and begin to look at planning, stepping back, retreating, if you will, taking the time off. Now I'm doing a virtual planning retreat just next week. We've gotten the board to commit to 2 to 3 hours on a virtual Zoom call, and that's going to be a retreat. It's certainly less time than a full day retreat, but it's very efficient, and that may be the most amount of time you can get from your board, 2 to 3 hours on a Zoom call, or even unbundling the days of retreat into a series of multiple meetings over time. Just make sure you provide that opportunity for folks to take the facts and data gathered in the environmental scan or SWOT analysis and make decisions based on that in an open discussion. Data-driven decisions. So that is it. I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I'm going to stop the sharing, if you will, so I can frankly see the chat function. And Caitlin, I'll leave you to help me out at this stage. Read a question or two that you can see there, and I'll keep an eye on the screen. Q&A, we've got about 10 minutes. What do you need to know? What did I cover so quickly you need to ask about, or what other questions might you have?
John, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, great. I want to make sure my unmute was working.
Good.
So we have one question that says, in your experience, does it make a difference when doing strategic planning if the executive director leads the process versus an individual from outside of the organization?
Okay. Well, building in the understandable bias that you need an outside consultant. So, and that's always a concern about cost and who's it going to be. In most cases, there's always exceptions, but if you're small and startup, perhaps the executive director has a key role to play and could even facilitate the process if he or she can bracket their bias, set it aside, and not lead the conversation. Unfortunately, on the downside, many times when an executive director wants to facilitate the process, it's her or his lack of willingness to let go of control of the nonprofit. Go back to that maturity model and realize that one of the key steps that you need to see for the growth of a nonprofit to move beyond founder syndrome is to realize it's not my nonprofit. So if you have an executive director who potentially is the second generation of leadership, for example, not that the founder can't do a good job, in most cases, you're going to guard against the perception she's biased. She's leading the conversation where she wants it to go. He's directing things to accomplish his own agenda. Bring in an outside facilitator. Maybe it's not a consultant. Maybe it's just somebody who knows how to run meetings. Maybe it's a board member, frankly, that can stay objective. But in most cases, the odds are a higher level of sophistication in planning means you need an outside facilitator. That would be my bias. There's always exceptions, but for some who ask that, no doubt somebody's going to see, I told you, or no, I don't agree, but that's probably a specific agenda item somebody had, and that's why they asked that question, Caitlin. I hope that helps.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. We have another question from Christina Hatch that says, what financial investment is appropriate to make to develop a strategic plan?
Well, you see, that's great. And in the old days, and genuinely as a consultant who gets RFPs all the time, requests for proposals to do strategic planning, there was always a pricing on, here's the data gathering, the cost associated with that, the interviews, the surveys, the focus groups, the number of billable hours. Now here's the retreat. We're going to summarize all that data. And then we have to have a dedicated day somewhere. You've got to rent the facility. You've got to have the food. You got to prepare all those materials. And then ultimately, even the follow-up, all of that's gone away. It's so much less expensive to do any of it. And frankly, I just worked with a group. This is a 35-year-old nonprofit in the southeastern United States. They had an in-house person who did graphic design. We captured all the decisions and in Google Sheets, which they still use regularly to analyze it. And the only cost associated with, and they actually took the plan and folded it into their annual report and made a very attractive, appealing document and left it as a PDF on their website to be downloaded. So essentially, other than arguably the hours devoted to planning times your hourly rate or your salary, there's costs there, because now as a staff person who gets paid to do these things, I now have to shift my focus to do these planning things. That's a cost, but hard out-of-pocket expenses, I think, can be driven almost to zero when it comes to doing strategic planning. And that's one more reason why, because we've heard sometimes nonprofits say, well, we can't afford to do planning right now. We can't hire the consultant. We can't get the venue and the offsite facility. Now those expenses tend not to impact the planning process. You can do it for next to nothing. Google Sheets are free. A SurveyMonkey account you can do for free. And at best, you need a Zoom account, which I think is $14.95 a month. So I would say $100 price tag doing virtual strategic planning is a lot of money, $100, if that helps answer that specific question. Caitlin, next.
Thanks, John. We just had another question from Marie Mudeman, who said, what about the cost of a facilitator?
And that may be a good point to contradict what he just said. You may say, okay, yeah, that's going to be the key. We've had so many planning experiences in the past that didn't go as well. They weren't as efficient or as effective as they could have been because we really missed having a professional, well-trained, experienced, seasoned facilitator, especially to spark good conversation, good conflict, good critical thinking, and you may have to pay for that. So in the nonprofit world, you may expect to pay anywhere from $50 to maybe even $200 an hour for a trained facilitator. But keep in mind, it can be a labor negotiator, it could be a mediator from the court system, it could be somebody from a guardian ad litem program who happens to be on your board who knows how to do facilitation, as I said earlier, so there still may be no cost, but at worst you can expect to pay a few $100s to get a competent facilitator if in fact that's your key. You say, yeah, we're not going to be successful unless we pay the money, and you might get a donation of their services. You might get a board member to underwrite the cost of that as well. It may be worth their weight in gold, frankly, to have a competent facilitator, and you may have to pay for it. Good question.
Thank you, John. We don't have any other, oh wait, one just came through. This is more of a statement than a question. Kathy Cummins said, check out Catch a Fire to find a qualified facilitator to work pro bono. Ours is a recent retired strategist from the CDC.
Excellent. Good
Thank you,
strategy.
Kathy.
Yeah. And I'm assuming, Caitlin, for somebody that may be drawing a complete blank and don't know where to turn or where to look for facilitators, perhaps to put you on the spot, they could reach out to you. And again, keep in mind, most broadly, they may not have experience in doing facilitation of a nonprofit strategic planning retreat, but keep in mind, you need somebody that knows how to facilitate. It could be a good teacher, again, a court mediator, somebody who negotiates big sales deals, somebody who knows how to listen, to summarize, and clearly has no agenda they want to advance at your retreat. And that sounds like a good resource there I'm not aware of, but a retired strategist from the CDC sounds like a great resource to turn to. So thanks for adding that, Kathy. So last minute questions or comments, any observations? Caitlin, I'm going to put you on the spot in just a moment. Since you're living strategic planning, you're actually involved with it at your foundation. Is there any takeaway that you've learned today that you had not heard before? I'm going to ask you that in just a moment, but I'm going to open it up in our remaining 4 minutes because I will end promptly on time at 1 o'clock Eastern. But any last minute questions at all? Anything else anybody needs to double check with me on? All right, as always, I would offer myself up, again, at no cost, no obligation. Feel free to email me, give me a phone call. I cover ground very, very quickly. I enjoy thoroughly doing this kind of teaching and training and want to really help you all be successful in planning going forward. Call me, email me. I'll be more than glad to chat with you over the phone. At this stage, it was great to have you here. There's a lot of ways you could be spending your time today. I've enjoyed, I see Kara is back with us as well. I've enjoyed the opportunity to be in front of you. It's the second workshop. The last one was on virtual fundraising, but I'll toss it back to you, Caitlin, and put you on the spot. Hey, Kara, and see, was there a takeaway, something you'd heard today? Not that I'm so brilliant or sharp, it's just that you had an aha or an insight about planning that you personally will leave here with today as a result of the planning that's going on in your own organization. Anything at all, Caitlin?
Yeah, of course. It definitely gave me some questions to think about that I hadn't thought about before that I can now take in and bring to the rest of our staff once we come together. As I said before, right now we've been talking about it on an individual level where we see the foundation going. And now that we're going to get together as a group, you've definitely given me some great points and some very helpful things to think about as we move forward on that. And thank you again for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate all of your help.
Great, and thanks for the positive feedback I'm seeing in the chat column. Kara, you've joined us. Is there anything else you want to add at the end, or I'll leave it to either of the two women in charge there to take us across the finish line? We're about 2 minutes before the hour. What else do we have to close this out?
I'll let Caitlin take it over, but John, you always do a great job and everybody loves you. So thank you so much for coming to us and giving us all these trainings.
Thanks for your vote of confidence. Caitlin?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone again for attending today. We're so glad that you're able to come to these trainings, even though we can't have them in person. And, definitely continue to look at our website, have more trainings with John coming up in the future. We do have a training up on September 15th that will be CPE credit eligible. So if you know any accountants or anyone that needs CPE credit, we will have that on our website shortly. And Brown Edwards is going to be hosting that one with us. But just keep looking out on your emails, and we hope to see you again virtually soon.
And I'll have the link of the recording to you later on today, Caitlin. Thank you all.
Okay.
Be well, be safe. Keep your mask on.
Thanks. Have a good one.